Welcome back to Northwest City Politics in the Know with Juanita. We're glad that you're joining us again this evening. We're glad for people like you that are interested in what's happening in our cities, because it is important for good government that city councils, city staff, and city residents all communicate with each other. That leads to better government. So we're glad that you're interested. If you haven't watched our program before, each week we'll have somebody on from one of the 9 cities in Northwest Community Television's viewing area, and we'll be talking about the issues going on in that city so you can update it on your city or on the other cities nearby you. So we're glad that you're with us. And then every once in a while we'll have people on that have information that covers all of our cities, which is what we're doing tonight. And I'm very happy to welcome Lyndon Carlson, who's a representative in the state legislature.
Well, thank you.
So we're glad to have you with us tonight. So we're going to talk about what happened or what didn't happen, I think.
Well,
right?
We've got some of both.
right, in the last legislative session, and kind of update people a little bit before we get into the fall election.
Sure.
And you've been on my show before, so you know I'm going to ask you to kind of introduce yourself to the audience. A lot of people from New Hope and Crystal and Golden Valley.
Well, I'm State Representative Lyndon Carlson, and my current district is about half the city of Crystal, almost all of New Hope, and 3 precincts, or about 10,000 people that reside in Plymouth. And you want to get into more background? Or?
Yeah,
okay.
A little bit so people know a little bit more about
and,
you.
My legislative experience, I was elected in 1972, and I'm currently serving my 22nd term. And an interesting little footnote, along with one other member, a year ago on July 13th, we became the longest serving legislators in history. So maybe I'll make it in a history book eventually or something.
Now, the legislative session was shorter this year. Was it extra short?
It was shorter. The second year of the biennium
is always shorter.
Was often shorter because, for example, when we talk about education, the main funding bill passed last year. This would have been a supplemental appropriation this year that dealt with several issues. The key one probably early childhood.
Right.
But it was shorter than usual for, I think, basically one major reason, and that's that the Capitol is being remodeled.
Oh, right,
and so space was at a premium.
Right,
and,
definitely.
So we started later than we normally would. We would normally start in January, maybe February. This time we started in March, and we constitutionally have to adjourn basically the third week in May, so that meant about a 2.5 month session.
So do you think that was part of the problems in getting through more bills?
I don't think that was necessarily the problem in terms of what I would call the Big Four that were ultimately ran into difficulty. We did pass the tax bill, and after it was passed, they discovered a minor wording area, or a minor wording problem. But had an impact of $100 million on the funding of the Viking Stadium.
Which was a controversial issue.
Yeah, the dollar amount wasn't minor, but it was just an and or an or made that difference in terms of how you would interpret it legally. So the governor then vetoed the tax bill for that reason, and otherwise that would have made it into law. The supplemental appropriations bill, one of the articles we were just talking about, or one of the initiatives with education was in that bill. That made it into law. But the bonding bill or the capital investment bill did not make it into law, nor did the transportation bill. So I would have said at the beginning of the session, the 4 big issues are those issues. And 2 of them, or one of them did make it into law, one almost. And I think if we have a special session, and it's pointing in that direction right now, that the tax bill will probably, with a couple of minor corrections. There were a couple of other things as well, but they weren't as major as the $100 million. Governor Anderson, I think he was interested in getting the best possible people to work in his administration. He reached out to the business community, where he worked with the Republicans for the Minnesota Miracle, and where he was able to, with some of his appointments, reach across party lines.
And because it seems like that's more difficult nowadays, right? For that to happen, for groups to work together? Or why don't you reflect on that a little bit?
Well, when you're kind of in the eye of the storm, it may,
yeah.
it's maybe not quite what's portrayed, in my view at least,
right.
in the press.
Ah, okay, good.
Because we passed a whole lot of legislation,
right,
bipartisan votes.
Right.
But sometimes when it comes down to, quite frankly, some of the budget issues, that's where it's become much more difficult. You know, how much you're going to spend on education, how much you're going to spend on state government overall, how much you're going to give for local aid to cities and counties. 70-some%, I think 77%, if I recall correctly, of the state dollars, the dollars that come into the state, go out to local units of government in the form of aid.
Right.
And a lot of people don't realize that. The biggest spending bill in the legislature is not education or health and human services, it's the tax bill.
Ah, okay.
And because that's where all of that aid and stuff is often carried, along with K-12 education, that aid goes through the tax bill or tax committee ultimately. So it may not be carried, or it's not carried in the tax bill per se, but it goes through the tax committee after it leaves education. A lot of bills go through more than one committee. So yes, he leaves a very strong legacy. I don't think very many statewide candidates, I can't think of any, quite frankly, unless maybe it was at one point at the highlight of Hubert Humphrey's career. But Wendell Anderson, after he passed what was in some quarters a controversial bill, the Minnesota Miracle, he carried all 87 counties.
Right. Well, no, there's 3 areas that didn't get passed but are also being a focus for special session. So we'll take the special session part and put it aside and just talk about what was in, we'll start with the tax bill. What were some of the items that were in there? Because that's the one that did get passed but didn't make it because of the error, right?
Yeah, one of the big issues was tax conformity. Minnesota's a conforming state, and tax conformity helps simplify our tax returns here in Minnesota, because once you've done your federal income tax, then you don't have to make many changes. Now, there still are a few changes, so we don't conform 100%, but if the feds allow for a deduction, generally we allow for that same deduction and so on. So tax conformity was a big issue in the tax bill. Another big issue was credits for student deductions on student loans, student debt. The maximum, and again that's based on several factors, but a student could conceivably get up to $1,000 in tax credits, or a former student. To help with the student debt, which is a huge issue.
Oh, a big issue.
I happen to take, I'll put a plug in for Consumer Reports, because they're a nonprofit. And I've taken Consumer Reports ever since I graduated from college. Their last issue deals with that whole issue of student debt and how much it costs students per month at various debt levels. And some students end up paying $1,000, $2,000. I remember a panel doing a presentation, and one of the panelists was a woman who was an attorney, and she had married a doctor. You'd think pretty high income, but it's also big student debt. And they would have still been paying off their student loans when their children were in college. So it has a real tail to it, you know, in terms of the long-term impact. But you know, they were in 2 very good professions in the end, but had a lot of education. But student debt is huge for students with a 4-year degree, or 2-year technical college or community college experience. And so that credit was probably one of the important ones in the bill. And then there was a lot of housekeeping initiatives in there as well. It was vetoed by the governor because of the $100 million mistake. It passed with a huge majority, bipartisanly, in the House and in the Senate. So if, and I think there will be a special session, I think the tax bill with that correction, and there's a couple of other issues that have surfaced, attacks on the state high school league that we generally haven't had in place, that may be removed, and a few others. One, there was an escalator on the cigarette tax.
Yes, right.
That was passed into law and was removed.
Right.
And a lot of the anti-smoking groups, the Cancer Society, the Heart Association, and so on, they would like to see that escalator reinstated. Whether that'll happen or not, I don't know. But there are those three issues that need to be corrected or not corrected, depending on the outcome of the legislature. But I think there's a fair chance that probably all three of those issues will at least surface as part of the discussion in a special session. And another big one in it, I shouldn't forget this one in case there's any soccer fans out there. The soccer stadium in St. Paul for property tax relief. That one is being built with private dollars, and it's being built on property that was a transit station and a garage, and was not on the tax rolls. And so St. Paul wanted the soccer stadium, and so they were willing to let that continue on. But then the stadium, after that's all paid for, I think 20 years out or something like that, will be signed over to the city of St. Paul.
Then the other area was transportation. Maybe you can talk about what were some of the basic differences between the Democrats and Republicans that made this issue not
I would have
move
predicted
forward
before the legislative session started that there was going to be a transportation bill. And it didn't happen. One of the big differences, the Republican members of the legislature prefer whatever money is available to go to roads and bridges by and large. You have to be careful to not say everybody, but the vast majority of them are taking that position. On the other side of the aisle, the Democratic side, roads and bridges, yes, but also mass transit. And a part of mass transit is the light rail question. And the Southwest rail, and then if a transportation bill is ultimately passed, and if Southwest rail is completed, and most of those are federal dollars that are coming in. The state obligation on a $1 billion plus project there is about $135 million, in the federal government and some other local dollars and so on come into play for the balance, but from the state perspective. And next up is Botno. And Botno has been moving right along. With the Southwest corridor, outside of the transportation bill and how you fund transportation, there is the big debate about how the routing takes place. And I remind my colleagues, I say, well, Botno has been approved by all the local units of government along the route. You know, so maybe we should be next up, but they do want to get the Southwest done. And we've been working on the engineering and the routing and the local approval option, which all of that has to be done. And Southwest has a lawsuit against it that's slowing things down.
But if they didn't get the funding, then it meant almost $1 million in federal funding, that you would lose.
With a B.
With a B. $1 billion,
and we keep hearing, but we don't know exactly when, that if Minnesota doesn't move forward with the transit funding, and there's also rapid bus routing and on the St. Paul side, and so it's not just light rail. But as far as the light rail, that St. Louis would be next up. So one argument you might make is that Minnesota taxpayers have paid into the federal government, and this is an opportunity to get some of those dollars back in the form of the light rail. If we don't get those dollars back, the folks in Missouri will benefit.
Then the other area was bonding, and from looking at it from the outside, it looked like a big issue between the two groups was how much should go into bonding.
And that was, as a member of the Ways and Means Committee, I kept advocating that there should be a bond target set
Right.
for the Capital Investment Committee. And for a long period, they kept saying no, no, no.
Right.
Then they came up with a number that was very modest
Right.
relative to what the state's needs were, and that was soundly defeated.
Right.
And literally the last night of the session,
Oh, yeah, that's what I wanted you to
they convened the
describe.
Ways and Means Committee at roughly 7:30, and we passed a target authorization that the
Right.
bill could have for general obligation bonds, roughly $1 billion
Right.
for capital requests. And then included in the bill were other forms of bonds as well. So it would have been more than $1 billion, but the other
Right.
forms of bonds are have higher interest rates. They're called appropriations bonds. And the advantage of the bonds that are the full faith and credit of the state of Minnesota is that you get a much lower interest rate.
Right.
So that was part of the discussion. How much should be appropriation bonds? How much general obligation bonds for the lower interest rate? But eventually, they came up with that the last night in Ways and Means,
Which is kind of late in the process.
yeah,
right?
and then they had drafted a bill
Yeah.
that they brought forward about 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
And this is the last night of the session where you have to constitutionally adjourn.
Oh, right.
You
right.
can't run
at,
over.
At midnight, that's it.
In the old days, before I was ever in the
Yeah.
legislature, they used to cover the clock.
Yeah.
And we'd see on TV a fellow with a big step ladder go out and
Yeah.
cover the clock, and then they'd run overtime.
Right.
But the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And I think rightly so. So
Right.
the bill, when it finally hit the House floor, and people were trying to find out what was in the bill because that hadn't been revealed.
Right.
It was finally passed at the last minute and too late for the Senate to act.
Right.
And so the bill failed. But I should point out that part of that issue dealt with transportation
Yes.
as well.
Yes, it did.
Because being that there wasn't a transportation bill in the traditional form with a separate funding stream,
Right.
whatever that funding stream
Right.
might be, the Speaker of the House at one point put out on the table increasing license tab fees. First day he said he wouldn't do that because it was a tax increase, and a day later he said, well, that's really a fee, maybe we can do that. And then there was talk of the gas tax. The Senate actually passed a gas tax increase. None of that was totally resolved, but then they were going to use much more in bonding than you traditionally do for transportation. There's always been some bonding done
Right.
in the area of transportation, but never to the extent that they had it in that bill. And what that does, if you start bonding more and more for transportation, and we need $7 billion over the next 10 years to basically hold even, then that crowds out the infrastructure needs in other areas, our colleges and universities that need new facilities or updating facilities, or just basic maintenance, roofs and tuck pointing and all of that. So that was a controversial part of that bonding bill, just how much should go to transportation, being that a transportation bill wasn't passed. The other thing that was controversial in the transportation section of the bill, other than that, it kind of dealt with some of the traditional things that you would deal with a bonding bill, but they earmarked transportation projects.
Right.
And that just is never done.
Oh, yeah.
And that can become very political.
Oh,
you know,
yeah, very.
If you've got a senior, powerful legislator that needs a highway, maybe that highway goes ahead of all others.
Right.
And so the tradition in Minnesota, the policy has been that the Department of Education prioritizes our transportation needs in the case of roads and bridges, and it's not done in a political environment with the legislators proposing amendments or getting their project in a bill. So that was a controversial part of it. And many of us have said if there is a special session and if transportation is part of the bonding bill, or if there is a transportation bill, that there be no earmarking.
Right.
Because that's not been the Minnesota tradition, and we've avoided a lot of politics as a result of that.
Well, that kind of gives an overview of what there is. So now let's move into what is a special session for people that might not be real familiar. How is it set up? What are the parameters?
Well, it's a brand new session, but maybe
Okay.
first of all I should mention that there's one person in the state of Minnesota that can call a special
Right.
session, and
Right.
that's the governor.
Yeah.
And what governors more often than not do, before they call a special session, they try to find agreement between the House and the Senate
Right.
and the governor's office as to what the agenda is going to be and what the content of the
Right.
bills will be. And that's what's going on currently.
Right.
Dayton has now indicated that he'll probably call a special session because they seem to be getting close
Right.
to resolving several of the issues. They're not all totally resolved. The third week in August. So the date that you sometimes hear is the 16th, but
Right.
it's more likely sometime during the third
Right.
week. And then we'll take up the very bills that we're talking about. I think the one with a big question mark is whether there will be a separate transportation bill and what the funding mechanism will be, or if transportation will be funded on a temporary basis,
right.
which is one of the problems with
Right.
bonding. That really becomes a one-year solution to a 10-year problem.
Right.
So that will be a part of that discussion between now and the third week. But then if there's prior agreement, you come in for a day or two. Those of us in the minority party, Paul Thiessen is the minority leader, he has indicated that he would like it to be set up so that the committees can have hearings on those bills, and not that you just simply have a session where you suspend the rules
Right.
and take the bills up. He feels, and I strongly agree with him, that the bills should be introduced, they should be sent to committee, there should be committee hearings where the public can
Right.
come in
Right.
and
Right.
weigh in and
Right.
say, you're spending too much, you're spending too little, you should spend it
Right.
differently, all those
Right.
things that happen in a committee hearing.
Right.
And so that will be a part of it. There are a couple of other bills that could conceivably surface. The governor vetoed a pension bill because he felt that the payments, we've got a shortfall with some of our pensions, and he felt that the
Right.
retirees were being hit harder than the actives in the various
Right.
pension plans, and he felt it should be more equitable and not just have one group
Right.
paying in. So he vetoed it for that reason, and some have said that that may surface as another issue. If that doesn't get taken care of now, it would probably be taken care of in early January.
Sure.
In fact, quite frankly, if we didn't have the special session, I'm sure some of these issues would surface very early in January.
Right.
But
Is it
there
the
are,
one-
with those construction projects, there are what we call shovel-ready projects,
Right.
where some of them could still be started yet, although it's later in the season.
Yeah.
And a bill like that, estimates vary, but probably would carry or create about 20,000 jobs, not immediately,
Right,
but as the
right.
projects take place in the construction industry.
And
So it's a
then-
big job creator.
Definitely. And then, why don't you talk a little bit about who are the people that are doing the negotiating?
Well, that's one of the reasons that the minority leader wants open hearings once the agreement is made. Quite frankly, it's three people basically. It's the majority leader of the Senate,
Right.
Senator Bach, the Speaker of the House, Representative Dowd,
Right.
and Governor Dayton.
Right, right.
And they're negotiating the parameters. At times, the two minority leaders, and the minority leader is a Republican on the Senate side, and the minority leader on the House side is a Democrat. So they have been in some of the meetings, but the point being that it's a very small group.
Right, right.
And so we feel that there should be better information to the public than where it's just
Right.
an agreement cut by three people. And I think in the end, I think they're going to be open to the committee hearings so the public can see what those bills look like. And just as importantly,
right,
what
right.
happened with that bonding bill when it came up in the last hour.
Oh, right.
Members were scrambling, flipping through to see, well, what's in the bill, what's not in the
Right.
bill. And that's a huge bill when you're spending $1 billion. I mean, that's
you want to give it a little more time, right?
You want to give a little more time so you can be more deliberative. And they were deliberate, quite frankly, in holding that bill up to the last minute, and that just simply should not have been done.
And then maybe you could reflect a little bit, because we're running out of time, on were there any particular parts of the bonding bill that covered this area, the 9 cities
there were requests, but they were not in that final bill.
Okay.
I would argue they were pushed out in part because of the large percentage of the bill beyond what normally would go to transportation, pushed out a lot of projects. And the City of Plymouth in our area has a request in to remodel their hockey rink. It needs some upgrading. It's an older rink, and one of the rinks is Olympic size, and they would like to make it a standard size for high school, college. And they need a roof repair and some other things done on the building because it's aged. And that would be a sharing of the costs, the City of Plymouth along with the state, so it's not a total state situation. And then there's the Cola Ponds on it's a flooding area that where Crystal, New Hope, and Golden Valley come together. And we need some flood mitigation dollars to resolve that flooding, and it helps all 3 cities. I happen to be the chief author of that one, as well as the hockey rink. But see, I represent out of the 3 cities. I've got part of New Hope, I've got part of Crystal, and I used to have part of Golden Valley, but never had actually that neighborhood of Golden Valley. So we want to get that flooding issue resolved, and hopefully if there's a transportation bill, and then we can shrink the amount of transportation dollars in the bonding bill and fund it through another mechanism, then maybe we can pick up some of those local projects. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, with the MnSCU system, our colleges and universities, what we call the HEAPR, that's the Higher Education Asset Preservation. That's where you get into the basic maintenance, and that's important for North Hennepin Community College, Hennepin Tech, which are our local colleges, but it's a statewide concern. And that's always a big major initiative. And kind of like the earmarking and transportation, when I mentioned MnSCU, they bounced around a bit. The St. Cloud project, which is it's a good project and a needed project, but to get to it, they passed over other MnSCU projects. And maybe it's just a coincidence, but the chair of Ways and Means happens to represent St. Cloud. So there were some eyes on our side of the caucus rolled on that. Not that we were opposed to the project, but we were saying, well, what about those in between? There was a violation there.
I want to thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Hope we didn't run over.
No. To bring us up to date on what did and didn't happen in the last legislative session, and what hopefully will happen when we come into August. So we appreciate your spending your time, and you're giving us the benefit of your experience.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Okay. Bye.